Welcome, everybody. Good morning. It's really exciting to kick off the Nerd Summit 2020 here. Used to be in UMass Amherst, now from the comfort of our own homes. So today I'm going to be talking about hacking your emotional API. I'm going to be talking about emotions and the impact that they have on our lives as developers. Quick content warning before we get started. I'm going to be speaking about divorce and the death of a loved one. And I won't be offended if you need to log off or take a break or whatever during the talk. So my name is John Sowers. In addition to being a founder, manager, and developer, I've spent many years helping people as they work through their deepest and most intense emotions. And based on what I learned doing that, I've created a metaphor to describe how emotions work. So I'm going to walk you through that metaphor. I'm going to talk about why it's important. And then I'm going to go into techniques that you can use to level up your skills. But first, I'm going to start with a quote. "Emotions just make so much sense to me," said no one ever. I think that's pretty funny, and I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. But I often wonder, why is it that so few of us feel like we really get how emotions work? And I think it has to do with how we're raised. At most, we only get half the picture. We get constant feedback as children about what not to do. Don't cry, don't make a scene, don't whine, don't yell, all the things we're not supposed to be doing. But what we almost never get is help with what we should do. Nobody says, this is what you do to be emotionally healthy. This is how you express your feelings in appropriate ways. Our parents probably didn't do this, mostly because they themselves probably didn't know. School was no help, because like parents, they'll punish you for improperly handling your emotions, but they give us no way to get better at it. So each of us has to figure out all of this stuff on our own, and some of us have only limited success. So I put this talk together because I want to help everyone improve in this area. And this talk is built from my own experiences. It's one way to approach understanding your feelings, but it's not the only one. So if this framework doesn't work for you, that's fine. I really hope that you can find one that does. So let's talk about our emotional API. These are our core API endpoints. They handle all of our basic emotions, and they're hardwired in. Every human comes with these. These endpoints don't get called directly. There's a layer of middleware in the middle there. In it, there are thousands of mappings that translate from the outside world, things that happen to us, to our emotional API endpoints. And these mappings are created over the course of our lives. You can see something comes into our senses, maybe we lose a job, or your mother comes to visit, or you have a new baby. And those are going to map to some sort of emotional response, whether it's sadness or anger or fear. And they're different for everyone. You can see the person on the screen here has very different reactions from the person on this screen. And we're also looking at a very simplistic case in the situation where a single event causes a single emotional response. Now, in most cases, emotions are a little more complicated than that. And so there can actually be chunks of code in this middleware that actually cause huge amounts of traffic into that core API. So let's look at an example of, say, the first item on that list, losing your job. The code for that could look something like this. We can see 100 calls to the fear endpoint, 20 calls to the sadness endpoint. This will cause a very strong emotional response. And there's some bad news. This is a public API, and any person can call any of these endpoints at any time. But it's okay, because by practicing some of the tools that I'm going to talk about, you can actually rewrite that middleware. You can change what's in this method. You can refactor and refine, and so you can get to choose the response that you send when any of these hits come into your API. And that's basically the metaphor. It's a framework for understanding and talking about feelings. And what I like about this model is that it breaks down a big, scary blob of ill-defined mess into smaller pieces that are a little easier to talk about. And I'll segue into the next section with another quote. "But feelings are icky and I don't wanna," which you have said, and I know I have certainly said. I don't enjoy working with emotions, and you probably don't either. And unfortunately, I can't change that. So to illustrate why it's worth going through the discomfort of doing this emotional work, I'm going to talk about some of the surprising and not so surprising ways that they affect us, especially in our work. I'll start with this unpleasant truth. No matter how much you want to, you can't actually avoid your feelings. In studies of people as they try to suppress a negative emotional experience, we see them fail. While participants thought they looked fine on the outside, the effects of the emotion remained or intensified in their nervous system. So emotions are unavoidable, and we'll get back to how to handle them in the toolkit section. For now, let's look at how they're affecting our ability to write code, in the simple case of just one person sitting alone at an editor. So unprocessed feelings make us feel powerless. And unprocessed means like they're not acknowledged or they're not really expressed. They're just sort of sitting around inside you without being really worked with. And they hang around. And so this sense of powerlessness I'm talking about is that sense of not being in control of, well, your feelings, or even in your life, your career, feeling like you can't handle whatever comes at you. And I think, now, if you think about the last time you had a big emotional upheaval, like losing your job in the example above, you probably didn't feel really powerful and in control of that situation. Studies that have looked at the impact of this feeling of powerlessness on cognition have highlighted specific deficits in executive function that arise. Now, executive function is our ability to control our attention, to plan, organize, remember details, and solve problems. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like what I do all day. So when that's impeded, we lose our ability to focus deeply into our code, find bugs, or design new and complicated systems. And these same studies show that it also affects short-term memory. If you think about how much of a program or the flow of a system you can keep in your head as you're tracing through hunting for bugs, when that's limited, you're not going to find them as quickly. We also don't handle stressful situations as well. So think about the last production fire you were a part of, or a demo with executives, or even crunch mode before a big release. These are all stressful situations, and they can either affect you this much or this much, like way lots. Conversely, when you have a good framework for handling your emotions, you get back that sense of control. You reverse all of the problems I just mentioned. In fact, when children were trained in techniques of emotional hygiene, they showed not only improvements in behavior, like you would expect, but also in academic achievement. They got better grades. Similar training in adults showed additional improvements in long-term physical health. Now, think about that. Your body actually works better when your emotions work better. So whether it's an open source project, a large corporate team, or a two-person startup, thriving in a diverse community requires us to develop skills in communication, understanding, and empathy. Being a good developer isn't just about slinging code. We're part of a community, and in many ways, the non-coding aspects of developer life are more important than the coding ones. So let's look at how feelings impact the way we work with others. One interesting thing is that when you develop an understanding of your own emotions, and we'll get to that in the later section, that work automatically translates into the ability to understand others' emotions, because we're humans and they work very similarly in all of us. And in his book, Emotional Intelligence, Daniel Goleman talks about data he's collected showing that emotional intelligence is correlated with career advancement. Basically, you're going to get better jobs and you'll get promoted faster when you have these skills. So when we regain this sense of power, we become less self-centered. When we feel like we are understanding our emotions, when we're in control of them, we are able to empathize with people better. Now, we rarely intend to cause harm with our words, but it can happen by accident. And when we understand others' emotional reactions, that empathy helps us predict how our words might come across, so we can preempt unintended harm that we may be causing. So there's a quote from a developer at the Valve game studio that sums it up quite nicely. It wasn't enough to be merely a good developer at Valve. If you were a good engineer with zero communication skills, your chances of surviving and thriving when I was there were pretty low. If you acted like an asshole and didn't have many friends, it didn't matter how good you were or how awesome your accomplishments were. People like this would be fired sooner or later. So let's go into some more detailed scenarios to illustrate how this might play out. From my perspective, you're a better developer if your cognition isn't being affected by your emotions. If you have the confidence to express your ideas and advocate for them, rather than staying quiet because you think incorrectly that nobody wants to hear from you. If your comments are full of empathy and understanding, if you don't make your teammates dread getting your input, if you're not distracted by difficult situations outside of work, if you can deal with coworkers that push your buttons, you don't want your job performance ruined by someone else who doesn't have their act together. If you can fight your impostor syndrome, or more importantly, realize when you're being gaslighted, when you can see a situation clearly enough to realize that you're being treated unfairly. If you can keep your cool during job interviews, if you can be fired without doing something you'll regret. And let's talk about leadership for a minute. These skills are critical for managing and mentoring a team. They're not just developers, they're also people. And being able to understand their emotional needs makes you more effective as a manager. A while back, frontside.io posted an article about what they look for excuse me, in a senior developer that talked about some of these issues. Notice that everything in this diagram has a huge emotional intelligence aspect to it. Connectedness, community, mentorship, leadership, ownership, purpose, finding the next right thing, curiosity. Even the technical capabilities circle talks about behavior and not about whether you've got 10 years of Java or not. Curiosity, discipline, fearlessness, these are emotional skills. So those are some of the reasons why we want to do emotional work. Now, I'm going to tell you about my emotional toolkit in the hopes that you can use these tools yourself. I've broken them down into 4 levels of difficulty. Level 1 are new ways to think about emotions. Level 2 are techniques you can use by yourself to start building fluency. Level 3 are applying those level 2 techniques, but with someone else. This is often a bit more difficult for people because it involves being honest and vulnerable with another person. Level 4 is the most difficult and most powerful level because it's very scary to be honest and vulnerable in a group. So let's start with level 1. Changing the way you think about your feelings can have a huge impact. Because we have no formal education in this, we collect a lot of misconceptions. So I'm going to clear those up and explain how feelings work. The first thing to realize is that your emotional reactions are not set in stone. They're legacy code that has built up over your lifetime, and it can be refactored. Secondly, we get to decide where and when we process our feelings. We have a great background job queue available that lets us find the best time and place to work with our feelings. So if now isn't a good time, we can push the feeling onto that queue for later. This is in fact the same system we're taught to use as children when we're told not to show our feelings. But because we've had no other emotional training, this queue has been growing our entire life. And as you know, a queue isn't very useful if you never pop the jobs back off of them and run. So techniques in this toolkit will help you do that. People often get caught up in what it means about them when they have a feeling. But having a feeling doesn't mean anything about you. It doesn't define you in any way. Feelings are personal, they can mean a great deal to you. But if you're feeling angry, it doesn't mean that you are an angry person. It doesn't mean that you can't control yourself. It doesn't mean that you're a monster. But strong emotions like anger can be scary because it feels like we're going to lose control. Now, notice what I just described. You're now having a feeling about having a feeling. This is where things get really messy and complicated, but it's actually fairly common. Imagine a situation where you're angry at your mother, but as a child, that wasn't something that was allowed to happen. So you feel ashamed of being angry because you were punished for it. Further, imagine you realize that this is going on, but haven't quite broken out of that cycle. So you feel disgust at the shame that you feel about your anger. This is not entirely implausible. So you can have all these multiple, maybe conflicting feelings about a situation. People always want to know which is the real one, but the answer is all of them. They're all there. They're all part of that situation. There's no such thing as how you really feel. The feelings that arise in a situation don't have to make sense either. Like, they were somewhat logical in that situation I described earlier, but they can be from completely out of left field. If you think about losing your job in the example earlier, you could react with relief, with anger, fear, guilt, or all four. There is no single thing that you should feel in that situation. Even if the feeling doesn't make sense, you still have to process it though. It's still going on in your body, and it's still something you have to deal with. For example, you could feel a situation's unfair. The feeling that it's unfair still needs to be processed, even if you realize intellectually that it is fair. It's not helpful to just say, well, I shouldn't feel like this, so I'm not going to. Because as we've seen, that doesn't work. Now, unprocessed emotions are basically emotional debt. Just like buggy, hacky, complicated code is technical debt. And just like tech debt code, emotional debt hangs around, makes things harder, and interferes with everything you're trying to get done in the present day. And one last piece. Many of us have had the experience of feeling like a feeling is so big that if we let it out, it's never going to stop. If I express this anger, I will never stop yelling. If I express this sadness, I will never stop crying. But that just won't happen. Experts tell us that feelings really only last about 20 minutes. And that's been my experience countless times. So that's level 1. Level 2 are actions that you can do on your own, both to build an understanding of yourself and your feelings, and to start having direct experiences of the concepts from level 1. So the first thing to realize here is that feelings are deeply, deeply connected to your physical body. They're not just mental processes. And all they ever want is to move through your body and out. It's like when you've had too much coffee. Your body wants to move. In fact, oftentimes the first sign of an emotional reaction is a physical feeling. Maybe your shoulders are hunched up, or your stomach is feeling all butterflies, or something like that. And so moving your body actually helps that physical sensation, the physical feeling, get moving and be expressed. So any of these activities, dancing, singing, exercising, running, any of these things will help to get you started, will get your body used to expressing that feeling. But to make real progress, you have to acknowledge the feeling and you have to feel it. You can't just go for a run and hope that it goes away. Now, a quick aside. Some of you may have heard of rubber duck debugging, but if you haven't, here's a quick summary. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you bang your head on a problem for a while, and eventually you get so frustrated you give up and you go ask for someone's advice? Then as you're explaining the problem to this other person, you suddenly flash into the solution, even before they've said anything else. This is such a common process that there's actually a hack has been developed to shortcut and streamline. So before you get to the point of asking someone else, you can explain the problem to a rubber duck on your desk. It also works with a dog or cat. If you just sit down and say the words out loud to them, it will often be enough to generate that same burst of insight, and you won't be bothering your coworkers. So back to emotions. Being aware of them, talking about them, and naming them is incredibly helpful. So here are some tips for talking about feelings. Now, you may have noticed that this is a section for things that you do alone. Let me explain. This is where the rubber duck comes in. The same hack works about your emotions. You can talk to nobody. Sometimes talking through a feeling is all that's required to resolve it, and there doesn't have to be another person in front of you. Think of it as a process of exploring a feeling space verbally. You may not even realize exactly what the feeling is until you say the words out loud that describe it perfectly. It can be very great for exploration and discovery. It can also be hard to find the right word for a lot of feelings because we have so little practice doing it. So don't worry about picking just the right word. Try lots and lots of words. Just say them out loud. See which ones start resonating for you and feel like they fit. This feel wheel can help suggest words for you. It was developed back in the 80s by Dr. Gloria Wilcox. It's not exhaustive, and you might not even agree with some of the way the feelings are broken down, but it's a good place to start. So I have a printed version of this that I'd be happy to send to anyone if you DM me on Twitter. I'll mention this again at the end of the talk. So when you're talking about your feeling, it's important to use the right language. When you describe a feeling state, people often default to saying, I am angry. But it's much better to say, I feel angry instead of I am angry. It's only one word different, but the meaning in a literal sense is very different. I feel angry says I'm currently having a feeling, which will pass. I am angry says literally, anger defines me. And, you know, this is a bit hyperbolic, but the underlying truth, I think, is there. So try and make that switch in describing your feelings, even in casual conversation, because it will be helpful. So talking through a feeling is basically calling your emotional endpoints over and over again. And like anything you practice, you get better at it. And you get more familiar with how it feels when you have certain feelings. I suggest doing a weekly emotional retro, like a sprint retro. Look back on your week, explore the feelings you had, even just naming them is helpful. Even better, you can go through them in depth, really start to feel them, and really get to the root of maybe what's causing them and find patterns. Taking the time to practice on everyday feelings will make it easier when the bigger feelings happen, as you'll have all this practice dealing. So you can develop a lot of skills and insight working on your own, as I described. Things get much more powerful when you get help from another person. In addition to helping you process your own feelings, talking through them with other people strengthens your relationship and increases empathy. It makes them feel trusted and included and increases their trust in you. One way that you can do this is to share your weekly emotional retro with someone. But emotional sharing isn't helpful in all situations. Imagine you're angry that a coworker repeated an idea that you already proposed and they got credit for it. You need to figure out what you're angry about. Are you angry at the coworker, at your boss, or just at the situation that happened again? When you figure that out, you can figure out how you want it resolved. And if you spend some time to really understand where that feeling comes from, you understand what would make you feel better. And you express that feeling on your own separately. Then you can go to the person that you think can help you address the situation. And you can approach them from a state of, this was an action that made me feel this way, and this resolution would be helpful in the situation. And in fact, it makes it much easier for the other person to help you out because they're not going to feel defensive and attacked when you come in with a big feel coming at them. And so it'll be much more productively resolved. Sometimes you also need to bring in a consultant. There continues to be this judgment that seeking therapy means that you're someone who can't cope with your life, that it's only for people with big psychological problems. But working with a therapist should have no more stigma than hiring a consultant to help you architect your next integration. They're a subject matter expert that you can call on to help you get unstuck or point out solutions you may have missed, and it's incredibly powerful. They're able to see your blind spots and notice patterns that you can't see yourself. So consider finding a therapist. For most of you, the thought of bearing your deepest emotions in a group of people is terrifying. It was for me years ago. And until I did it, I had no idea how powerful it could be. So at the urging of someone I trusted, I went to a workshop called Purpose, Passion, Peace. I'll call it P3 for short. There, I was able to find an incredibly safe space, a group of people who cared about me and where would help me face all of the big emotions that I'd held on to for my whole life. And it was such a great experience that I went back to volunteer every weekend, several times a year for years and years. Eventually I started supervising and now I'm teaching these workshops. I don't have any psychology training, but I learned so much from the direct experience of working through my own emotions and seeing how the commonalities apply to all the other people I worked with. So I'm going to tell you about my experience with anger to start. And I'm going to do it for several reasons. First, it's a vivid example, I think, and I want to illustrate some of the level 3 and 4 tools that I'm talking about. Secondly, vulnerability breeds more vulnerability and connection, and I need more of that. Thirdly, and most importantly, I want to model the behavior. I want you to see what it looks like. I want you to know it can be done in front of a Zoom full of people. So as a child, I was not allowed to get angry. Other people used up all the anger points and there were none left for me. So I had to repress it. I had no other option but to be pleasant and agreeable all the time. And I did that for 30 years. But once I got to the end of that 30-year stretch, I started to realize how much anger had been hanging around from earlier times. I was deathly afraid of it. This is what my life would have been like when I'm in my early 30s. Here's an API hit, something small, doesn't even matter what it is, but makes me really angry. And maybe I'll think, why did that make me so angry? But most of the time, I'll just maybe punch my desk or snap at somebody or just be in a bad mood all day. And I'll think, oh, that was weird. I don't wonder why that affected me so much. But then it'll go away and I'll think, all right, that's fine. But then it'll happen again and again and again. So at that point in my life, my instruction book for dealing with anger is what you see on the screen. Nothing. I had no idea how to do it properly or how to do it at all. My therapist at the time tried to get me to let it out. She had this tiny little office, and I was convinced that if I let out even just a little, it was never going to stop, that I would destroy every piece of furniture in that room. So I was pretty stuck, and I had no way of dealing with that anger. It wasn't until I was at P3 that I felt safe enough to let it out. And I screamed and I raged through the biggest fit of my entire life. I just let that anger flow out of me. Didn't even care what it was about. It just came out. And I did it in a room full of strangers. And nobody died and nothing broke and nobody was upset with me. It was a very transformative experience. Then I did it again and again, several times. Not every time I went, but whenever I needed to. And it was amazing. Every time I felt like I was 100 pounds lighter. So throwing a fit is one of the techniques I'm going to talk about. And it's actually really hard to do as adults because we've spent most of our life trying to stop that process from happening. So it takes a little practice to get into the feeling state and let it out. Now, what we're going for is the worst toddler meltdown you've ever seen. And you know exactly what that looks like. On the floor, screaming, kicking, throwing, punches, all of that. In fact, we've all probably done it before, but we're trying to stop it. So to do this, you need to find a place that's comfortable to do it, either a big bed or an air mattress, something without a lot of breakables around by, something you can be comfortable thrashing around a little bit. So it's hard to get started because our brains are like really organized around not doing this. So the trick is to actually start doing the action before you feel the feeling, and that will actually bring the feeling out of you. So as I was saying, when the feelings are in your body, and so moving your body in a way that is congruent with the feeling will help the feeling come into your body, and then you'll feel it and you can let it out. So you start by yelling and kicking and screaming on the bed before you feel angry. And that's the hardest part because you'll feel like a complete idiot while you're doing this. But it will bring that feeling up, and then you'll start feeling it. And then you can just ride that energy, put everything you've got into those kicks and screams, and you'll really let a lot of feeling out. It's going to be exhausting. You probably won't be able to do more than 10 minutes of this. And you'll feel amazing a couple of days later. So that's one step that I can recommend. And you can do this on your own. You can have a trusted friend there to keep an eye on you, or you can find a group like P3 to be surrounded by people who can assist you in doing this kind of thing. And I've done it a lot. Of course, these days, I still get angry. Things happen that make me angry. That's never going to stop happening. But the anger I expressed today is the anger from today. It's not also the anger from when I was 12 or 7 or 15. And so it's not caught up in all those old issues. And it's much easier to work with. And I don't always have my act together enough to do this. It's a little tricky to find time and space and really make a time for this to happen. But when I do, I just set away some time and throw a fit. So we're going to move now from anger into sadness. This simple series of API calls describes a big part of my life. Each one of these hits is devastating. They all multiply together. You see that there are different versions of the API at different ages, and we'll see how that plays out in just a moment. So when I was 5, my parents divorced, and I experienced pretty much every emotion under the sun at that point. Fear and sadness and blame, all of these things together. I had no idea how to deal with it. Now, the 5-year-old mind is very self-centered. It really assumes that it's in control of a lot more than it is. So even though everyone told me that it wasn't my fault, it really felt like it was. And then when I was 8, I found out my father had cancer. I felt more fear and more sadness. And those feelings brought together for the older feelings and mixed up and amplified and swirled together all these other things. It made it even harder to deal with what was going on at the time. And when I was 17, my father died. And again, those same feelings came up even stronger this time. And then they still built on those earlier feelings, mixed together, swirled around. The magnitude of the feeling was overwhelming. I held on for dear life and hoped that it would blow over. It did not blow over. It affected me for quite a while. 15 years in the future, I'm working as a coder. And it's a regular Thursday release. And I let a few bugs slip through. Now, nobody wants to release a bug to production, but it's not the end of the world if the CSS is wonky at the bottom of the FAQ. But this is how it felt to me: panic. Because I had all those unresolved feelings about my father. Now, every male boss that I had was a stand-in for my father. So when I fucked up at work, all these same feelings came in. Here's a stack trace of that feeling. You'll notice the highlighted lines. These are the old lines of code that I wrote when I was 5. They're the root of that feeling. Because when my father left, the only reaction I could come up with was panic. And so when my boss is bad at me, I feel like my dad's going to leave again. It's a terrible situation. I'm massively overreacting. So have any of you written code when you were 5? And was it really good code? Probably not. But you can see how, like, I'm reacting to something as a 32-year-old adult, but with a script written by a 5-year-old. And this is what these old unresolved feelings do. They trap a part of ourselves at the developmental stage that we're at when the trauma happened. So feelings related to that trauma are handled by the most primitive and damaged parts of ourselves. And that's what I'm talking about when I describe emotional debt. So to get through this, I did what you do with sadness. I cried. Again, when I felt safe enough to do this, when I was in P3, I cried until my stomach muscles hurt. And I did it over and over again. It's not something that you get resolved in a weekend, but I spent a lot of time letting the sadness out, and I got it all. Once that grief and sadness were gone, I worked on other feelings: anger and shame and fear. Now, if you remember this slide from before, all these things are happening. And I worked through each one in turn, each of them that came up after the grief was gone. And when I finished, I'd refactored this endpoint. This is what it might look like now. Here's a diff. So of course, if my father died now, I would feel a lot of grief, but I wouldn't be damaged by it for the next 20 years, deeply affecting every decision I make and every reaction I have. I'm not running that outdated code anymore. And you'll like this. You can sometimes rewrite an entire method. If you remember that buggy release from earlier, this is what it might look like now. It's basically a no-op. So that's some of my baggage. And I talk about a little bit how that affected my life. And now I'd like you to think about what baggage you might have and what you're bringing to your relationships, both at home and at work. Are there parts of you that react to things like a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old? And that's my toolbox. Every one of these tools is just a hack to get you to one place, feeling a feeling, not stopping it, not analyzing it, not denying it, not indulging it, just feeling it, because that's all feelings ever want. Now, since forever, these types of skills have been called soft skills, and it irks me every time I see the phrase because it's so incorrect. It takes a lot of time and work to build up these skills, far longer than it takes to learn C or Ruby or Docker or whatever it is. And so that's why I'm here speaking, because I'm hoping my framework will help you get there faster. And as I start wrapping up, let's talk briefly about next steps. You know how you read that one blog post about best practices, and you get really excited and you want to start implementing all of them in your project right away. And you know how you give up after about 10 minutes because you realize the inertia of your code base is so huge that you can't make any big changes quickly. That's how it's going to go with your emotions. These are big, complicated systems that will take a while to change, but we can make progress every day. So don't try and do everything in all the levels I talked about. Just pick one thing from this talk that you particularly resonated with, that made a lot of sense, and just remind yourself of it in your day-to-day life. Just think about things in a slightly different way or do one little practice and see how that affects your life. And once you've got that sort of integrated and going, watch the video again. There's a bunch of videos of this available online, and pick another thing and integrate that one. And then slowly you'll build up these skills. And also a note of warning, as you start building up skills in this area, it's tempting to judge other people who don't have them, to think of yourself as more advanced. And I want you to fight that feeling. Fight the part of your ego that says that you're better than they are, because you're not. You just have a few more tools. So if you can, use these tools to help these other people, help them get through what they're going through, and help them get better at going through things in general. This is how we make ourselves and our lives and our world better. Okay, let's everyone take a big, slow breath. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. It's been wonderful sharing the Zoom room here with you. If you DM me on Twitter, I will send you a feel wheel. Just send me your address. You can see the slides for this talk here. You can see videos at emotionalapi.com, and you can find me at emotionalapi. Also, if you go to emotionalapi.com and sign up or use this link, you'll get on my emailing list and you'll get a free copy of the Emotional API Quick Reference, which goes over some of this in a nice printed form that you can look through. And here are references to a lot of the research that I looked through as I was building this up.
John, this is Lily. Thank you. I'm wondering, do you want to try if I unmute everybody so we can try people talking?
Sure.
It's easier to type some of this stuff. Let me try that.
Yeah.
Let's unmute everybody. Well, I told it to unmute everybody.
They have to say yes.
Yes. Oh, all right. If you all want to say yes, that'd be great. I'll lead off with something. Thank you. I love this. Awesome analogy. Really helps me grok my own self. One of the things that I agree with you that someone's EQ is so much more important in working with them so that we can learn together. How does one, if I'm trying to find out, if I'm trying to hire somebody, are there good questions or tools that you can recommend to help discover someone's EQ? And I don't give a damn about their tell me how you code in C++.
Yeah, I think that's still emerging what the really good ways to do that are, but the one that strikes me that I'm using currently is asking behavioral questions. So saying like, tell me about a time there was a conflict on your team, what was that about and how did you handle it? And, just getting them to talk about like how they were interacting with that situation and how and you can even steer an interview into those sorts of topics either before or after you get into the technical stuff as a way of sort of probing into how they think about like how emotions should be handled with work and how they think about teamwork and those sorts of things.
Great, thank you. If other people have questions, feel free to speak up. The shy crowd. Well, one thing that I have used as a tool myself is when I was going through a very challenging time, I would go for long walks with the person while talking about emotional things, because I found that side by side, going in the same direction together felt a lot more like we were trying to solve the problem together than butt heads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's really intense when you're looking face to face with someone, especially if you're both, talking about feelings. And it can be a lot. It can bring down the sort of level of intensity if you're both facing forward. And I think the walking is a good metaphor for like, let's move forward together. But even doing that, and especially being outside, it feels like you've got more space to sort of move and feel. So yeah, that's a really great technique, actually.
Lisa asked that you mentioned the group P3 several times. Can you tell us about P3, please?
Yeah, so it's a weekend long workshop designed to get people, deeply in touch with, old trapped emotions and feel safe enough to express them in a very, very supportive environment. So there are actually, I had a slide, I think it went away, with links to a bunch of the P3 workshops. There's a few of them in Florida and North Carolina and a few other states. There's also a group called the Crucible Project that has, I think, a bunch of states in the eastern half of the U.S. available. I can post links to that in the chat. Actually, I'll dig them up and post them here.
I actually had a question that I wanted to ask. When, in particular, to the section where you were talking about, sort of making yourself have what you described as a tantrum. I'm wondering, I know I have, we've all heard the very sort of simplistic advice to like scream into a pillow or punch a pillow or something like that. But I know in more recent years, I've heard some research that has suggested that actually prolongs those emotions. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, and how that ties into what you're recommending.
Yeah, it's definitely possible to make a feeling last longer than 20 minutes. So what I'm talking about in all of this is like when a feeling comes in, like putting your all into it, really letting it go, putting like as much of your physical body into it as possible, that gets it moving out of you. Now it's possible where like you were describing, if you're doing some like pillow screaming or any of these techniques, actually, you can use them to go to like 50% intensity, and then you can still hold on to the feeling. You can still keep it around. You can actually prolong it for a long time. And that's part of like it's sort of a subtle point I tried to make at the end about like some people actually really like their feelings and want to hold on to them and do things like this to like make sure the feelings stay around because they feel like they validate what their worldview, or because they're comfortable because they've always felt this way. And so that's like one of the tricky bits about this. So you can do the pillow screaming. It can be great as a tool for expression. It can also be used to prolong, like you were saying. But I found it useful.
All right, thank you. I also had a quick recommendation I wanted to add on to resources. If anybody is looking for a therapist, one of the best resources I found for finding a therapist that will work for you is the Psychology Today Therapist Finder, because it allows you to filter by a bunch of different criteria. Yeah, and it allows you to see pictures of the therapist. So I would recommend that for anybody who's looking for a therapist.
I agree. My wife is on there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very extensive list. And you can filter by insurance and techniques and all sorts of things.
All right, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? If not, then I will say thank you so much, John. This has been great. I think rather than post your links in the chat here because the recording is going to stop, if you could go to the Slack channel, to the Slack, and post it up there because it will hang around for a while, and people who haven't even made it to the session but might have it recommended will be able to bop over there.
Okay, I will do that. I'll also tweet it out.
Excellent. And everybody, please don't forget to do the feedback. There's a link in the chat channel that https:/nerd.ngo/feedback. And thank you all. And thank you, John. This was awesome.
You're welcome.
And
And thank you.
Is muted.
And thanks to Lee and Rick and Kelly and all the rest of the organizers and sponsors for making this happen, even in such trying times.
You got it.